Now, I was going to make 3 points about challenges, 3 points about progress, and 3 points about opportunities, but maybe I've only got time for 1 point about each. But I'll plough on irrespective and just talk more quickly.
That worked for me.
So firstly, progress. Have we made progress in these past 10 years? Well, yesterday we had the Prime Minister of Cambodia commit to appointing a national focal point, to taking a lead on R2P in ASEAN, to promoting R2P within Cambodia, and to facilitating regional dialogue on the responsibility to protect. So yes, I think we're making progress. More globally, I think that the responsibility to protect is a norm, as Gareth Evans pointed out like that last night. It is not an emerging norm, it is not a concept, it is now a fully fledged international norm. And by that I mean two things. Firstly, we have a shared expectation that states and non-state armed groups must not commit those crimes associated with the responsibility to protect. Secondly, there is an equally shared expectation that when these atrocities do occur, the international community must do what it can to protect populations from them. Why do I think this is a norm? Well, firstly, as we've already heard in this conference, the UN Security Council keeps telling us that the responsibility to protect is a norm and that the international community ought to be doing something to protect populations from these crimes. Even in the most difficult and contentious of situations, such as that in Syria, the Security Council has been able to come together in a consensus on some issues. It has come together in condemning atrocity crimes against civilians. It has come together in action to disarm the Syrian government of its chemical weapons. And it has come together in demanding humanitarian access so that civilians can receive humanitarian assistance. So even in a situation like Syria, as contentious and difficult as that is, the norms of the responsibility to protect have sometimes come shining through. And sometimes a good test of a norm is to look at what the international community does when there is failure. So does the international community think that the Security Council has handled the situation in Syria well? Does it think the Council has discharged its duties? Well, the answer is no. The General Assembly has on numerous occasions signalled very clearly that it thinks that the Security Council is falling short of its protection responsibilities. It voted by, I think, 132 votes to 14 to specifically deplore the Security Council's record on Syria. And on other occasions, the General Assembly has voted by equally large majorities to recommend precisely the sorts of measures that were vetoed in the UN Security Council. So I think we can safely say that R2P is a norm. In fact, in one of the most contentious debates in the UN General Assembly, the 2012 dialogue on R2P that came, of course, in the wake of the 2011 interventions in Libya, South Africa, one of the leading critics of NATO's intervention in Libya, made this point. They said, irrespective of our concerns about the implementation of Resolution 1973 on Libya, there could be no going back on what was agreed in 2005. The question is not whether we want a responsibility to protect, but how to deliver on the commitment in real situations. The second thing where I think there has been progress is in building a community of practice and deepening that community of practice, working on the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities and protection of populations from that. Spanning states, international organisations, NGOs, through things like the Groups of Friends, the Focal Points Network, GARMAC, the Latin American Network for Genocide Prevention, the High-Level Advisory Panel on R2P in Southeast Asia, and meetings such as this, we've seen over the years a widening and deepening of this community of practice working together to deliver on the goals of the responsibility to protect. So we have more actors working in more ways to achieve the goals of R2P than we did have 10 years ago. And the third area of progress is that the protection of populations from these crimes is now at the core of how the international community thinks about and responds to international crises. It's not that long ago that the UN Security Council could, with no sense of irony, create a UN peacekeeping operation called the UN Protection Force, but did not actually have a mandate to protect anybody, let alone civilians. This happened in the 1990s. Today, protection is front and centre of the Security Council's response to most of the world's crises and front and centre of most UN peacekeeping operations, as Simon has already mentioned. So I think that's progress. Also, the Secretary-General has announced a Rights Up Front action plan to mainstream a focus on human rights protection right through the UN system. While there remain serious questions about its implementation, nevertheless, it's part of a broad trend where protection is now at the core of what we do, and that, I think, is progress. What about the challenges? Well, I think there are three challenges. The first is breaking what I see as a taboo of assistance and prevention. We all agree that prevention is important, yet time after time we fail to do what's needed to prevent atrocities. Now, this is partly because states are reluctant to ask for help. I think one of the key questions going forward is how do we encourage states to ask for help? How do we make it a global positive to ask for help? We know that asking for help can deliver good results. The Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands is one very good example where a government asked for help, received that help from a regional institution, and was able to turn the tide. Yet there is still a stigma attached to it. There are still problems with encouraging states, understandable problems. But we need to think about a new type of politics, a politics that encourages states to ask for help and that reassures states that when they do ask for help, that help will be given in full and in a manner consistent with the values and interests and concerns of the state involved. We also need to think about how we translate our commitment to prevention into actual preventive work. That involves thinking through developing strategies of prevention, getting a better sense of what works and what doesn't work on prevention, so that we might tailor preventive strategies to specific crises and specific problems and specific places. Which gets me to the second point, which picks up and basically repeats something that Simon's already said. We need to do much better on delivering on the protection mandates we already have and on guaranteeing non-recurrence. Whilst it's right and proper that we should worry a lot about the politics of the Security Council and those debates about mandates that we can't get, we shouldn't take our eye off the ball of delivering on those that we can. We need more and better peacekeepers. We need peacekeepers with concepts, doctrines and capabilities to deliver on the protection demands set by the Security Council. We need better civilian capacities to do the mediation and diplomacy work that's needed to assist states to rebuild after conflict and to manage that transition and support states and societies in that transition from war to peace. And thirdly, we need to confront head-on what Ed Luck once called the risks of relevance, those controversies that come up as a result of the practice of the responsibility to protect. And we should not forget that there is no blueprint for implementing the responsibility to protect. There is no one-size-fits-all solution, no cookie-cutter approach, and that in many ways policymakers are making this up as they go along because there is no other way of doing it. So we need to confront head-on issues about the use of force. Firstly, by carefully distinguishing concerns about coercion and the use of force from wider concerns about Pillar 3 or reaction. Pillar 3 is not all about the use of force. Much reaction doesn't involve the use of force. And it's the use of force that is the difficult issue with member states, whether it comes in the context of the responsibility to protect, or in the context of counter-terrorism, or in any other context in which the Security Council, through its collective security provisions, has to deal with use of force questions. But we need to deal with that. We need to deal with the very real objections that arose out of Libya, and we need to think about the Council's working practices and think about questions of accountability in particular. We also need to think honestly and openly about the role of the International Criminal Court and the relationship between the court and the responsibility to protect, and face head-on some of those challenges and concerns, particularly those emerging from sub-Saharan Africa. And we need to think carefully about the pushback on things like early warning, the raising of protection concerns by UN country teams and others, where still too often the raising of protection concerns can create strong political backlash. We need to create expectations that talking about protection and protection issues are a normal part of what states do. So what about the opportunities? Well, I think there are three. The first, I think, is building partnerships for protection. Sometimes I think quantity has a quality all of its own. And the more actors, types of actors and different levels that we can get operating on this issue, the better. Ed Luck and others have pointed out that protection and prevention always work best when the UN works in tandem with relevant regional organisations. So deepening the relationship between the UN and the region is absolutely critical, and doing better at coordinating positions between the region and the UN is absolutely central. Secondly, we've talked a bit about focal points, and they're absolutely central to taking the dialogue further, to engaging more states in that dialogue and allowing them to have a say along the way in sharing experiences, sharing national conditions and framing future policy debates on R2P. We should also ensure that we place the Joint Office at the centre of much of what we do. I think that the Joint Office is an indispensable resource that links regions to the UN and connects different parts of the United Nations together. I think we should do more as regions and civil society organizations and member states to reach out to the office, and also ask that the office does more to reach out to those beyond New York. Fourth, I think parliamentarians are a key resource that we need to tap into more. There are parliamentary groups working on human rights, especially in this region. Parliamentarians are key individual actors with national profile, able to raise issues in a way that few other sorts of actors that can, push agendas, ask states to take positions, and be a galvanizing force. Here in Southeast Asia, we have the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, who are long been a powerful voice for human rights. More broadly, the Interparliamentary Union has taken a strong stance on the responsibility to protect. And finally, we need to think about partnerships across sectors. So we've heard a lot in the last 2 days about how different sectors relate to one another. Rather than being seen as a sense of frustration, weakness, and overlap, we should see that as a source of strength and look at ways in which different sectors can be galvanized to support the common goals of atrocity prevention. The second set of opportunity comes from the fact that this is the year of the 10th anniversary of the responsibility to protect. We can reflect on what's happened over the past 10 years and set a new agenda for the future. And I think those agendas need to be both top-down and bottom-up. So top-down, I'd like to see the UN Secretary-General set out a clear strategy for the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, clearly indicate how that strategy would be embedded within the UN system, and what it is member states and regional organizations ought to do. I think the reports so far have done a very good job of setting the parameters and defining some of the key types of practices and capacities, but I'd like to see clear guidance on what a strategy for prevention might look like going forward. I think there's also a role for the UN General Assembly, and I think it's time for the General Assembly to put R2P onto its formal agenda. Whether for good or bad, there is no better way of engaging member states in dialogue about the future direction of R2P and its implementation than putting it on the formal agenda and having an annual debate, a substantive debate that leads to substantive outcomes. It will make many states uncomfortable, but as Ed Luck said the other day, maybe that's not a bad thing, and a degree of discomfort can be useful in driving forward dialogue and forcing us to be creative. From a bottom-up point of view, I think we've also heard talk about the individual responsibility to protect. And I think more talk about the individual responsibility to protect, affirming the different roles that individuals can play and supporting individuals in their different roles. And then finally, I think we need to build on the national constituencies. Ultimately, decisions about R2P are going to be taken within states, within communities, within societies. And the work that we can do to foster national dialogue about their responsibility to protect so that we have national constituencies that can influence government and also work within their own communities to achieve the goals of R2P, the more we can make these global values a daily lived reality. And then really finally this time, I think this conference itself creates an opportunity for the future, an opportunity to take regional action to implement the responsibility to protect to the next level. I think it could be seen as the beginning of an ongoing Track 1.5 dialogue on R2P. I think it could be seen as deepening the base of understanding of R2P. And I think in some of the comments we've heard today in various sessions and yesterday, there are some concrete ideas for ways in which we can take these forward. Ambassador Sotirak has already identified a menu of work that will keep him and his staff and his partners busy for quite a few months and years to come. But I think other areas of work that we can focus on are encouraging more governments to appoint focal points and doing more to support those governments that do appoint focal points. Looking at ways of working the values and goals of R2P into the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights so that the dialogue about R2P becomes mainstreamed in wider dialogues about human protection and human rights. Looking at ways of working atrocity prevention considerations into the work of the ASEAN Regional Forum that already works in substantive areas closely related to R2P, such as peacekeeping and preventive diplomacy. Strengthening the way the region supports and assists its member states to achieve these goals. Strengthening the complementarity of work between R2P and other areas such as women, peace and security. And strengthening the contribution the region makes to the global effort to implement R2P. We shouldn't see R2P as just something that happens in the Asia-Pacific, but it's also something that the Asia-Pacific has an important contribution to make worldwide, not least through UN peacekeeping operations where this region ranks highly among major contributors. So I think the message from this conference and that I take home is that there's much we can do to work together now to deliver on this shared commitment to R2P. This includes commitments that states in this region have made to each other. So we all have an opportunity now to move forward, to work together to achieve this common goal, and by helping each other to do so. Thank you.